She could not stop looking at the coat. The silver service caught the candlelight and threw it back in fragments across the dining room ceiling, and the guests at the table were laughing at something Lord Ashby had said, and somewhere in the kitchen a pot had been dropped and was still ringing, and none of it mattered because she could not stop looking at the coat. It was wool. Dark, storm-coloured wool, worn at both elbows and mended along the left sleeve in her own uneven stitches, because she had never been much for needlework, and her father had never minded. She would know those stitches anywhere. She had made them by candlelight 3 winters ago, while he dictated letters to her, his voice warm and unhurried even then, even as the debts were already gathering around them like weather. The man wearing it sat at the head of the table, the Duke of Blackwood, Arthur Thorne. The most powerful landowner in Derbyshire, possibly in the entire north of England, a man who held the livelihoods of every family in the valley in a ledger she had once been close enough to touch. He was surrounded by the kind of guests who laughed too loudly and wore too many rings, and he was wearing her father's coat as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She had given that coat to a beggar 4 hours ago. She had stood in the sleet at the crossroads beyond the estate gates, and she had pulled it from her own arms, and she had wrapped it around the shoulders of a shivering man slumped against a milestone, because her father had taught her that you gave what you had. She had said something to him as she did it, something she had not planned to say, something that had come out of her before she could catch it back. And then she had walked the long road home in the cold without it, and she had thought that was the end. She had thought that act of release was the end of something. She had not known it was the beginning. The Duke lifted his wine glass. The candlelight moved, and for one terrible moment his eyes found hers across the length of the table, and Elara Vance, daughter of a disgraced clerk, temporary parlour-maid, woman with nothing left to lose, felt the floor beneath her feet become something she could not entirely trust. She kept pouring. Her hands did not shake. She would not allow her hands to shake. But the coat was right there, her father's coat, her father's mended sleeve. And the man wearing it was smiling at something Lord Ashby had said, a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile that looked like a door bolted shut from the inside. Now I want to pause here, just for a moment, and speak to you directly, because I find I need to. I wonder where you are tonight. A quiet kitchen, perhaps, or a chair pulled close to a radiator on a grey afternoon. Wherever you are, I am glad you found your way to Whispered Thrones. If Elara's courage has already caught your attention, if you are already leaning forward a little, please do subscribe and stay with us. We have many stories left to tell, and I would hate for you to miss what happens next. Now let me take you back to where this began, in the mud and the cold and the last of a dying winter. The winter of 1818 was the kind of winter that tested what people were made of. It arrived in November without apology, and showed no signs of loosening its grip as January ground toward February. The river at the foot of the valley froze solid enough that the Ashby children skated across it, on blades tied with cord to their boots, and the older villagers said they had not seen ice like that since the year Napoleon fell. The roads between the villages turned to hard ridges of mud that cracked underfoot like old pottery. Every chimney in Blackwood Vale smoked from morning to night, and still the cold came through the walls. Elara Vance had arrived at Blackwood Manor 10 days before Christmas, with a letter of reference that was technically accurate and strategically incomplete. It named her father only as a former solicitor, without specifying which solicitor, or for whom he had worked, or how he had died. The housekeeper, Mrs. Greer, had looked at the letter, looked at Elara's hands, decided they were capable hands, and given her a cap and an apron, and a room the size of a wardrobe at the top of the back stairs. She was hired as an extra parlour maid for the winter season, which meant she was temporary, and everyone treated her accordingly. The permanent staff had their hierarchies and their corners and their silences, and Elara did not try to insert herself into any of them. She polished the silver and swept the hearths and said yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and kept her face arranged in the particular expression she had perfected over the past year, the one that said nothing at all. The sharpening stone lived in her apron pocket. She had taken it from her father's desk on the morning they came to take the furniture. It was a small, flat piece of dark whetstone, smooth from years of use, and it sat in her pocket the way some women carry a locket or a prayer card. When the work was tedious, or when the fear got too close, her fingers would find it and trace its edges, and it would remind her of him, of the sound of quills being sharpened on a cold morning, of the particular smell of ink and old paper that had been his study. Her father's name was Thomas Vance. He had been a solicitor's clerk, a meticulous man with beautiful handwriting and an exact mind, and for 11 years he had managed the accounts of the Blackwood estate with a precision that was, by all accounts, remarkable. He had taken no holidays. He had worked through 2 illnesses that should have kept him in bed. He had loved his work with the quiet intensity of a man who understood that work was, among other things, a form of love. He had died in a debtor's prison the previous March. The charge against him had been embezzlement. £2,300 missing from the estate accounts. The investigation had taken 3 months and had concluded before Elara had been allowed to say a single word in her father's defence. By the time the verdict came, Thomas Vance had already been in prison for 6 weeks, and 6 weeks in a winter prison with a chest that was already failing was more than enough. He had died on a Tuesday morning. Elara had been told on a Thursday. She had buried him in a pauper's grave. She had stood in the frozen churchyard with 3 pennies in her pocket and said the words herself because she could not afford a minister. And then she had walked back to the single rented room they had shared since the estate had evicted them from their cottage, and she had sat down at the table, and she had begun working out what to do next. The trunk of his things was all she had. His clothes, his few books, his papers, which she had been careful to keep even when everything else was taken, a habit born of his teaching. He had always said that a well-kept record was the only armour a person of no means could wear. She had his ledger copies. She had looked through them in the weeks after his death, searching for the error, the oversight, the accident that had brought all of this down. She had found nothing wrong. Every figure she checked matched. Every sum she traced balanced. Her father's records were perfect, and that perfection was its own kind of agony, because it meant either her father had been extraordinarily careful about concealing something, or someone else had been extraordinarily careful about arranging it to look as though he had. She had been sitting with that question for nearly a year when she took the job at Blackwood Manor. She had told herself she had taken it for the money and the shelter, both of which were genuine and urgent reasons. She had told herself she was not hoping to find anything. She had told herself she was practical and pragmatic, and that she was not her father's daughter in the sense of believing that truth eventually asserts itself. She had not quite convinced herself of any of these things. The Blackwood Manor was enormous in the way that houses built by people with no particular need for restraint are enormous. It sprawled across the top of a low hill above the valley, all grey stone and tall windows and chimneys that the wind liked to play with. The grounds were formal and extensive, frozen now into a strange beauty, the topiary shapes furred with ice, the gravel walks glittering and treacherous in the mornings. The house employed 17 indoor servants in the winter, more in summer, and the Duke himself had not visited for almost 4 months. Elara had been careful never to ask why. The estate manager, Mr. Hallowell, ran the house in the Duke's absence with the particular energy of a man who had grown very comfortable with authority that was not quite his. He was a compact man in his early 50s, with small, efficient movements and the habit of appearing in doorways without any preceding sound. He had looked at Elara twice on her first day, and not looked at her since. She had decided that was fine. She preferred not to be looked at by Hallowell. She was learning the house quietly, the way water learns a landscape, where the floorboards announced footsteps and where they did not, which corridors connected where, which rooms held which records. She told herself this was only natural curiosity. She told herself it was nothing. And then the Duke's estate coach arrived on a Tuesday morning at the beginning of February, unexpected, unannounced, and everything changed. Elara was not there to see him arrive. She was at the crossroads, half a mile down the lane from the estate gates, sat with her father's coat over her arm and 3 pennies in her pocket, and a merchant in the village who had offered her 4 shillings for it. 4 shillings was food for 3 weeks. 4 shillings was the difference between surviving February and not surviving February. She had been carrying the coat to sell it for a month. Every time she had reached for it, something had stopped her. It was the last thing of his that still held his shape, the specific curve of the shoulders, the particular way the collar sat. She had mended the left sleeve herself. She had folded it and unfolded it so many times that the lining had grown soft as skin. That afternoon, she had finally made herself do it. She had put the coat over her arm and walked out into the sleet and told herself she was not going to cry, and she had believed herself, though right up until the moment she reached the crossroads and saw the man. He was sitting with his back against a milestone, as though he had simply stopped and decided this was far enough. The sleet was coming down in earnest, the kind of sleet that cannot decide whether to be rain or snow, and so commits to being both badly, and he was soaked through his jacket, a thin wool jacket that was doing him no good at all. His head was down. His shoulders were up around his ears against the cold. She stood and looked at him for a moment. She was 22 years old, and she had spent the past year learning all the ways a person could justify not helping someone. She was familiar with every one of them. She knew, abstractly, that she could not afford to help this man. She knew it clearly and completely, how in the same part of her mind that kept track of pennies and meals. She crossed the road and crouched beside him anyway. He was not asleep. When she got close, she could see the tension in his jaw, the deliberate stillness of someone managing pain or cold by holding themselves very still. His hands were resting on his knees, and she noticed them because they were at odds with the rest of him. Long-fingered. The knuckles roughened, yes, but the palms not calloused the way a labouring man's palms would be. Not the hands of someone accustomed to this kind of cold. She said, "Are you injured?" His head came up. His eyes were grey, or something close to grey. She could not quite settle on the colour, and there was something odd about the quality of his gaze, a haziness at the periphery, as though he were looking through something very slightly unclear. He did not answer immediately. He looked at her the way a person looks when they are reassessing what they were expecting. Then he said his throat was fine, he was only cold, and she should not concern herself. His voice did not match the jacket. She noticed that and said nothing about it. Her father had taught her that you could learn more by not saying what you noticed than by saying it. She stood up, and she took the coat from her arm, and she wrapped it around his shoulders before she had finished deciding to do it. The wool was dry, or dry enough, and it was thick, and it was all she had. She said what she had not planned to say. She said, "He was an honest man. I hope it brings you better luck than it brought him." She turned to leave. His hand caught her wrist. The grip was too firm for a man half frozen at a crossroads. She felt it before she fully registered it, a steadiness and precision in the fingers that did not belong to someone who had been sitting in the sleet. She went still, and in the moment before she pulled her arm back and walked away, fast, not looking back, she felt his eyes on her with a focus that had nothing hazy about it at all. She did not sleep well that night. She lay on the narrow bed in the small room at the top of the back stairs and listened to the wind working at the window frame, and she thought about the grip. She had given things away before. Small things, necessary things, the last of her bread once to a child outside the market, a dry cloth to a woman caught without one in the rain. She had never had anyone take hold of her wrist. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself he was probably confused or frightened, or simply reaching for any warmth he could find. She told herself she had done a good thing, and it was over, and she would not think about it again. She thought about it through her morning duties. She thought about it while she polished the silver for the dinner that was now 3 days away. The high-stakes dinner Mrs. Greer had been building toward for a fortnight, the one where the Duke was expected to host a small party of neighbours. She thought about those hands as she rubbed the tarnish from the serving spoons, the long fingers and the roughened knuckles, and the grip that had felt for one odd moment like something deliberate. It was while she was cleaning the library 2 mornings after the crossroads that everything else began. She should not have been in the library. The library was a room for the senior staff and family only, but one of the parlour maids was ill, and the schedule had collapsed in the way that winter schedules will, and Mrs. Greer had told her to see to the grates and surfaces in the rooms on the east corridor and come straight out. She had done the grates and she had done the surfaces, and she had been about to come straight out when she noticed that papers had blown from the desk to the floor, probably the wind through a draughty window, and she had crouched to gather them. She had not intended to read them, but the first page was a land deed, and the second page was a land deed, and the third page was a letter referring to those deeds, and the letter used figures, and the figures were ones she recognized, not because she had seen these specific pages before, but because she had traced these specific transactions in her father's copies, the ones she had checked and rechecked in the months after his death, the transfers that should have been recorded in the main accounts, the ones that were not. She crouched on the library floor with her duster in one hand and the papers in the other, and went very still. There had been a second set of transactions. She could see it now in the references the letter made, in the way the figures were routed through what was described as a subsidiary account. the subsidiary account that her father had not been authorized to access. The subsidiary account that could only have been managed by someone with a higher authority over the estate's financial arrangements. Mr. Hallowell's signature was at the bottom of the letter. Elara put the papers back. She put them back exactly as she had found them, or as close to exactly as she could manage, and she stood up and picked up her duster and walked out of the library at the appropriate pace for a parlour maid who had seen nothing of interest. She had not quite reached the back corridor when Hallowell himself appeared at the far end of the hall. He looked at her. The full look this time, not the dismissive glance of her first day. This was a look that took inventory. She felt it move over her face and register something, and she did not know exactly what he had seen, but she knew from the shift in his expression that whatever it was enough. He told her to report to Mrs. Greer. He said there had been a complaint about her work. He said it with the particular smoothness of a man who had arranged for there to be a complaint. She went to Mrs. Greer. The housekeeper was unhappy and uncomfortable, which Elara understood, because Mrs. Greer was not a cruel woman, only a practical one, and the practical thing was clear. She was told she was no longer required. She was given her wages for the fortnight and told she could leave in the morning. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and put her hand in her apron pocket and found the sharpening stone and held it. She did not have anywhere to go in the morning. She was still sitting there when she heard the commotion below. More coach wheels. Voices she did not recognize. The particular quality of activity in a house receiving someone important. She went to her window and looked down into the courtyard and saw the Duke's man directing the unloading of several trunks. The Duke had arrived early. She learned over the next hour, through the fragmented intelligence of the back corridors, that there was now to be a dinner that very evening. Not the formal dinner planned for later in the week, but an immediate one, pulled together from what the kitchen had. 6 guests already present in the county, and invited by a note that had apparently gone out that morning. Mrs. Greer needed every pair of hands available, including hands that had just been dismissed. Elara was told she could stay through the dinner and leave in the morning. She went to the silver room and began to polish. She was still not thinking about the crossroads. She was thinking about the deeds. She was thinking about the figures. She was turning the numbers over in her mind with the methodical attention her father had taught her, placing each one in its proper relation to the others, building the picture from the inside out the way you build a proof. She was quite far into the picture by the time she was sent to serve in the dining room, and she had the silver jug in her hand, and she was moving along the sideboard, and then she looked at the head of the table, and she stopped breathing for a moment. She did not stop moving. She kept her hands functioning, and she kept the jug level, and she kept her face arranged in the expression that said nothing at all. But inside the chamber of her chest, something lurched and then went very quiet, the way a struck bell goes quiet once the sound has passed through it. He was wearing the coat. The Duke of Blackwood was sitting at the head of his own formal dining table, surrounded by his neighbours in their evening dress, wearing a dead clerk's mended wool coat over what she could see. At the collar was a proper evening shirt. She could see her own stitching on the left sleeve from across the room. She had pulled those stitches tight by candlelight, while her father read her a passage from a Fielding novel and laughed at his own choice of excerpt. She had thought it was a coincidence for perhaps 4 seconds. Then she had remembered the grip at the crossroads, and the voice that did not match the jacket, and the eyes that were hazy, but not, somehow, unseeing. She kept pouring wine. She was very careful with the wine. The dinner went on for 2 hours that felt considerably longer. The guests were the variety of neighbours who used social occasions to conduct the business they were too well bred to conduct directly. And there was a great deal of laughter that was not quite laughter, and a great deal of comment that was not quite statement. The Duke presided with a detachment that read, she supposed, as aristocratic boredom. He spoke rarely. When he did, the table quieted with the instinctive deference of people who depend upon the goodwill of the person they are listening to. 3 times during the dinner, she felt his attention move in her direction. Not his gaze exactly. He was looking at his guests, but something in his posture shifted slightly, an orientation, set a quality of awareness that a woman who has spent a year learning to read rooms could detect as easily as she could detect a change in air pressure before a storm. He knew exactly who she was. The meal was almost finished when Mr. Hallowell rose from his seat. He rose with the confident unhurriedness of a man who has prepared what he is about to do. He said in the warm voice he used for public occasions that he was sorry to interrupt the proceedings, but that a matter had come to his attention that required immediate address. He said that a piece of property had gone missing during the evening, a gold snuff-box which had been on the sideboard before dinner and was now not there. He looked at Elara. He did not look at anyone else. He looked at her directly and steadily, and said that, regrettably, there was only one new member of staff who had access to the sideboard this evening, and that he thought it was best if they resolved the matter before the constable had to be troubled. The room changed. She felt it change the way you feel weather change. Every face at the table reoriented, the particular social rearrangement that happens when someone is accused in front of witnesses and everyone is deciding at speed how much distance to put between themselves and the accused. She did not look at the Duke. She looked at Hallowell and said, clearly enough to be heard, that she had not taken anything. Hallowell said, with genuine pity in his voice, that she would of course say so. Someone at the table murmured something. Someone else made the sound of reluctant agreement. 2 footmen appeared at the doors to the dining room, which meant Hallowell had arranged this in advance, which meant this was not a suspicion, but a plan. She looked at the Duke then. He was watching her with the same detachment he had used all evening. His hands were resting on the table. He was wearing the coat. He did not intervene. He did not speak. He watched her the way a naturalist watches something in a specimen jar, with professional interest and personal removal. She was walked to the mudroom by one of the footmen. The door was closed. She was told to wait. She waited. She stood in the mudroom among the boot-jacks and the drying cloaks and the smell of wet wool, and she put her hand in her pocket and found the sharpening stone, and she did not cry, and she did not pace, and she thought very clearly and quickly about what she knew, and what she could prove, and what she was willing to do. She had maybe 20 minutes before the constable arrived, if someone had already gone for him, which she thought was likely. She thought about the deeds on the library floor. She thought about the figures she had memorized because she could not take them with her. She thought about her father's voice saying that a well-kept record was the only armour a person of no means could wear, and she thought that this was one of the moments he had been preparing her for without knowing it. She also thought about the coat, about the decision to wear it here, to this table, in front of her, about what kind of man made that particular choice. And somewhere in the dark of the mudroom, beneath the fear and the calculation, so a different feeling rose, not quite anger. Something older than anger, something that had been waiting for nearly a year and had finally identified the correct direction. She tried the mudroom door. It was not locked. It was only closed. She picked up her lamp and walked to the library. Now, I want to speak to you directly again for just a moment. Because you are here, in the middle of this story, and I think you already sense where this is going, the shape of it, the weight of what Elara is carrying toward that library. I want to ask you something. Have you ever known the moment before you said the most important thing you had ever said? Have you ever felt the exact second when you stopped calculating and simply decided? That is where Elara is right now, and I want you to feel every step of it with her. The library at midnight was a different room than the library in daylight. The fire had burned down to embers, and the candles on the mantel had been snuffed by the staff after dinner, and the only light was the lamp she carried and the faint orange glow from the grate, which was enough to see by if your eyes adjusted, and hers did quickly because fear does something to the senses, pulls them to a useful sharpness. She had expected to be alone. She was not alone. He was standing at the far window, his back to her, the coal of a cold fireplace behind him, and the shape of him very still against the dark glass. He had taken off the evening coat, or robes, or whatever had been worn over it at dinner, and he was standing in the wool coat, her father's coat, his hands clasped behind his back. He had not lit a candle. He had been standing in the dark. She stopped in the doorway. He said, without turning, that the constable would be here in half an hour. She said she knew. He said she should have stayed in the mudroom. She said a great many things she should have done, and not doing them had not yet killed her. He turned then. She could not see his face clearly in the low light, only the shape of it, the jaw and the forehead, and the particular way he held himself, which was the way of a man who had been taught from birth that rooms belonged to him. He was wearing those tinted spectacles. She had thought earlier in the evening that they were an affectation or a medical necessity, or some combination of the two, and she had not paid them particular attention. She paid them attention now. She had noticed 3 days earlier something she had not intended to notice. She had been in the back corridor carrying a tray when she heard footsteps in the unlit passage that connected the corridor to the east wing. She had been about to lift her lamp to help the person navigate, and then she had watched the Duke of Blackwood walk the length of that unlit passage, without hesitation, without touching the walls, without slowing, and step around a footstool that had been misplaced against the skirting board in exactly the way a man navigates an obstacle he has already seen. She had filed that away and said nothing, because she had learned that the things you say nothing about are often more useful than the things you announce. She had spent the days since recalibrating every assumption she had made about him. She stood in the library doorway now with her lamp in her hand, and she said to him, "You were not at the crossroads by accident." It was not a question. She watched him to see what he would do with it. He did nothing immediately. He looked at her for a moment, with that quality of looking she had noticed during dinner, the attention beneath the detachment, and then he said he had wondered when she would reach that conclusion. She said she had reached it rather earlier than he expected, she thought. He said, "Perhaps." She walked into the room. She set the lamp on the desk. The light spread between them, and she could see his face now, fully, the lines around his eyes, and the particular set of his mouth that she was learning to read. He watched her move with an attention that had no haze in it at all. No blurriness, no distraction. The eyes behind those tinted spectacles were entirely precisely focused. She said, "You knew who I was. From the beginning. From the crossroads." He said he had been looking for her. He said that sounded worse than it was. She said she would decide that. He held her gaze, and he told her. He told her about the letter that had reached him, eventually, through the kind of circuitous route that letters from dying men in debtors' prisons take when no one is supposed to be paying attention. Her father had not written to beg. He had not written to plead or explain or ask for mercy. He had written to tell the truth. He had written 3 pages in the careful hand she knew as well as she knew her own, laying out the specific transactions, the specific subsidiary account, the specific signature. And he had asked for nothing in return except that the Duke look at the numbers himself, because the numbers her father had written do not require a man's reputation to speak on their behalf. The Duke had received the letter 6 weeks after Thomas Vance's death. He had spent 2 months sitting with it, testing its claims, finding gradually and then unmistakably that the numbers did exactly what the letter said they would do, which was tell the truth if you knew how to ask them. He had come to Derbyshire to look. He had used the beggar's disguise because he had used it before, on other roads, for other purposes, to see what he could not see from the head of a dining table. He had wanted to see the daughter. He had wanted to know what kind of woman she was, before he decided what to do with what he knew. She listened to all of it. She stood very still and listened, with her hands at her sides and her face not doing anything that she had not decided to let it do. When he finished, the library was very quiet, just the settling of the fire and the wind at the windows, and her own breathing, which she was controlling carefully. She said, "You sat at that table tonight, in his coat, knowing what you know." He said he needed to see how she would respond. She said, "You wore his shame to dinner like a trophy, Your Grace." She said it quietly. She said it the way you say the thing you have been carrying so long that saying it aloud is almost a relief, even if it costs you everything. She said, "You sat there in the wool of a man who died in the cold because he was too loyal and too careful and too much of an honest man to expose your house's rot. And you wore it to dinner, and you watched me serve you wine, and you said nothing. You watched Hallowell accuse me of stealing, and you said nothing." He opened his mouth. She said, "I am not finished." He closed his mouth. She put her hand in her apron pocket, and her fingers found the sharpening stone, and she drew it out, and she looked at it for a moment, just a moment, and then she crossed the room and placed it on the desk between them. It made a small, solid sound against the wood. A full stop. She said, "You wanted to see if I was a thief. You wanted to test me. A woman who had lost everything, who was sleeping in a room barely larger than your wardrobe, who was serving your guests on the same evening she had been dismissed, who had no shelter beyond this house and no future beyond tomorrow. That was your test. And you wore my father's coat while you administered it." She looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at the figures in the ledger, without flinching and without sentiment, looking for the truth that was actually there, rather than the one that was convenient. She said, "Sharpen your wits, Duke. Your eyes aren't the only things failing you." The room held that. The fire shifted. A log cracked and settled. The wind had quieted outside, or perhaps she simply could not hear it any more. He was very still. Not the stillness of control, not the contained, deliberate stillness she had seen from him all evening. This was a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes after something has landed, and the person is deciding how to remain standing. His jaw moved once. His hands, which had been clasped behind him, came around to his sides. He looked at the sharpening stone on the desk. Then, without any of the practiced grace of an aristocrat, he sat down, not in the chair behind the desk. On the edge of the chair beside it, the visitor's chair, the chair for people who came to the desk rather than presided at it. He sat in the chair of the person who needed something. He took off the tinted spectacles and set them on the desk beside the stone. His eyes, unshielded, were grey, truly grey, not the ambiguous colour she had thought at the crossroads. And they were looking at her with something that cost him. She could see it cost him, the particular expense of a person who has kept themselves armoured for so long that lowering any part of the armour is a form of pain. He said, in a voice that had none of the Duke in it, "I have been looking for a villain for a long time. It is a habit, and it makes me very bad at looking for anything else." She said nothing. She waited. He said, "Your father was an honest man. I knew it when I finished the letter, and I have not known what to do with knowing it since." The sharpening stone sat between them on the desk. She looked at it. She thought about her father reading Fielding aloud while she pulled those stitches tight. She thought about the churchyard and the 3 pennies and the words she had said herself because she could not afford a minister. She thought about a year of carrying this and having nowhere to set it down. She said, "Then do something with it." He looked up at her. She said, "The deeds are in this library. The subsidiary account records are in this library. I know where they are because I saw them on the floor 2 days ago, and I read everything I could before I had to put them back. I can find what you need. I can read them faster than any clerk you have, and I can see exactly what they say, and I can tell you precisely how Hallowell moved the money." She paused. She said, "But not to exonerate you, to exonerate my father." He looked at her for a long time. The fire had settled further, and the light was lower, and in the near dark of the library it was possible to see that the Duke of Blackwood, without the coat of his authority, without the armour of his cynicism, without the useful fiction of a man who is only coldly efficient and never uncertain, looked rather less like a king, and rather more like a man who had been alone with something heavy for quite a long time. He reached into his coat pocket, not the evening coat which was folded over the back of the desk chair, the other coat, her father's coat. He reached into the pocket of the dead man's wool, and he drew out his signet ring, and he set it on the desk beside the sharpening stone. He said, "I cannot see the lines clearly tonight, the light and the stress of the evening. Go to the archives, take the ring. Whatever you find, it will hold." He said, "Be my eyes, and I will be your sword." She looked at the ring. She looked at the stone. She picked up the ring. They found the deeds in the archives before 2 in the morning. They found the subsidiary account records before 3. Mr. Hallowell confronted with them in writing, so with the Duke's own hand on the document of record, and a woman who could read every number aloud from memory if the ink proved too fine for the candlelight, had very little room left to manoeuvre. He attempted several things in sequence, first indignation, then alternative explanation, then a kind of flat denial that even he seemed to know was not convincing. By morning, a rider had been sent to the magistrate. By the following week, the matter was in official hands. The constable, when he arrived that night, was told there had been a misunderstanding about the snuff-box, which had been found, and that no one's services were required. He went home. Elara was not arrested. She slept for the first time in many months with something that was not quite peace but was at least not terror. The process of clearing her father's name took 3 months. She spent those 3 months at Blackwood Manor in an unofficial capacity that gradually became a formal one, sitting at desks that were not her desk, and reading documents that no woman in that house had ever been given to read. And she was very good at it, which surprised no one who knew her, and surprised everyone who had only seen the apron and the cap. The position of chief auditor of the Blackwood estate was not a position that had ever existed before, for a woman or for anyone. Arthur Thorne created it. There were people who said it was improper, and people who said it was outrageous, and people who said it would never work, and Elara listened to all of them with the expression that said nothing at all, and then continued working. She moved into the cottage at the edge of the grounds in March, when the ice was beginning to break on the river, and the first tentative suggestions of spring were appearing in the mud of the formal gardens. It was small, and it was hers, and she put her father's books on the shelves, and she kept the sharpening stone on the desk where she could reach it. Arthur went to London in April for the surgery. The cataracts were treatable. He had known they were treatable for some time. He had been, as he acknowledged to her once before he left, afraid of what he might have to change about himself if he could see clearly again. She said that was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. He said that was not a high bar given the previous evidence of his character. She said, "No, but it's a start." He came back in May. She was at her desk when she heard the coach on the gravel. She did not go to the window. She kept working because the quarterly accounts were due, and because some habits of self-possession are too useful to abandon just because the occasion might warrant it. She heard footsteps on the path to the cottage. She heard a knock at the door. She said, "Come in." He came in without the tinted spectacles, and without the armour of the Iron Duke, and without the cool remove of a man who believed every act of kindness was a transaction. He looked at her directly with clear grey eyes that took in the room and the desk, and her face with the uncomplicated directness of a man who can see and is glad of it. He was carrying the coat. He had had it cleaned and mended properly, the left sleeve repaired by someone with steadier hands than hers. The wool brushed back to something close to what it had been, and it was folded over his arm the way you carry something you have been taking care of. He came to where she was sitting, and he laid it over her shoulders gently, the way you offer something you understand the value of. She put her hand in her own pocket and felt the sharpening stone. Outside the window, across the grounds, the first buds of spring were opening on the old trees at the edge of the estate, pale and tentative and entirely determined, and the river at the bottom of the valley was running free and loud with snowmelt, and the world, for the first time in a long time, smelled like something beginning. "Before I let you go tonight, I want to speak to you one more time." We come to the end of Elara's story, and I find myself thinking about what she understood that the Duke took so long to learn, that a coat is only wool and thread until someone gives it with a whole heart, and then it becomes something else entirely. Dignity is not a quality conferred by rank or station. It is something a person carries in their own pocket, like a small piece of smooth dark stone, and it belongs to them regardless of what anyone else decides. Elara knew that. Her father knew that. And in the end, Arthur Thorne learned it too, from the woman who had nothing and gave anyway. If this story found you tonight, if you sat with it all the way to this last moment, I am grateful for your company. please do subscribe to Whispered Thrones and share our stories with someone you think might need them. After all, a story shared is a debt settled. Until next time, the person you help in the rain may well be the one holding the keys to your future. But more importantly, when you give what you have with a whole heart, you are already carrying the most valuable thing there is.